Hello there, quiet travelers. Tonight, we explore a theory hidden inside the pages of Midnight Sun. The idea that Edward Cullen's decision to leave Bella Swan was never a sudden reaction, but a plan he had already been building. Long before a single drop of blood ever hit the floor. What if the paper cut was never the cause, but simply the permission? What if Edward had already made his choice and was only waiting for the moment that made it feel justified? If there's a Twilight story you'd love to fall asleep to next, tell me in the comments. I'd love to create it for you. Alright, get comfortable. Close your eyes and let's step inside the mind where the goodbye began. Edward Anthony Mason had been 17 years old for 87 years when he arrived in Forks, Washington. And in all that time, across all those decades of accumulated existence, he had never once stopped being afraid of himself. This was not the dramatic, performative fear of someone who enjoyed their own darkness. It was quieter than that, and more corrosive. It was the specific fear of someone who understood with perfect clarity what they were capable of, who had seen the evidence firsthand, who carried the proof of their own monstrousness in the form of 5 years' worth of human deaths, and the memory of how much he had enjoyed them. Edward did not romanticize what he had done during his decade away from Carlisle. He didn't dress it in the language of vigilante justice, though that had been his justification at the time. He knew what it had been. He had been a killer who had found a satisfying story to tell himself. And when the story stopped working, he had come home and confessed everything. And Carlisle had held him without judgment. And Edward had understood in that moment that being forgiven by someone as good as Carlisle did not mean he had earned the forgiveness. He had simply received it. That was different. And so, the decades that followed had been a sustained, quiet argument between what he was and what he was trying to be. He hunted animals instead of humans. He attended high school again and again, enduring the same curriculum, the same social performances, the same numbered years of meaningless repetition. He lived within Carlisle's carefully constructed family, among people who chose every day to be something better than their nature. And he matched their choices because it was the right thing to do and because he had no appetite left for the alternative. He was controlled. He was disciplined. He was, by every external measure, exactly what Carlisle had hoped he might become. But the thirst did not go away. It never went away, and the voices in his head never stopped. And this was the detail that exhausted him more than any other aspect of his existence. The telepathy that had manifested during his transformation, the ability to hear the thoughts of every mind within range, had once seemed like a gift. Carlisle had framed it that way, gently, In those first disorienting weeks when Edward was learning what he had become, an ability, a uniqueness, something that might serve a purpose, what it actually was, across 87 years of uninterrupted exposure, was a form of relentless intimacy he had never consented to and could never escape. He knew things about everyone around him that no one should know about anyone. He knew which of his teachers harbored cruelties they would never act on but never stopped imagining. He knew which of his classmates had been hurt in ways they had told no one. He knew the specific texture of Emmett's easy joy, Rosalie's layered grief, Alice's flickering anticipation, Jasper's constant vigilance against his own desire. He knew Carlyle's faith and Esme's love, and he was grateful for both and exhausted by the intimacy of knowing them so completely without being asked, without the possibility of looking away. Forks, Washington suited the Cullen family for practical reasons he had long since memorized. The cloud cover, the rain, the small population that allowed them to maintain their constructed story without the constant friction of too many curious minds. He had tolerated it. He had done what he always did, which was to manage his existence with the precise, exhausted competence of someone who has been managing the same impossible situation for longer than most civilizations last. He woke each morning, which was a manner of speaking since he did not sleep, and he performed the preparations required to move through a human day. He drove his siblings to school. He sat in his assigned seat. He tuned out what he could and endured what he could not. He returned home. He hunted. He existed. That was the word for it. Existed. Not lived. Not experienced. Existed in the specific way of something that continues without particular reason to stop. He had made peace with this, or something close enough to peace that he rarely examined the difference. He was not happy, but he was not in pain. He was functional. He was controlled. He had decided somewhere around 1960, probably what he was going to be forever, and forever was simply what it was. Then it was a Monday in January, and then the door to his biology classroom opened, and the air changed. The scent reached him before he saw her. This was always the sequence, with vampires, the olfactory information arriving ahead of the visual, the body responding before the conscious mind could process or intervene. He had experienced this countless times across his existence. The automatic categorization of a new human by the particular signature of their blood, the brief flare of thirst managed and set aside, the return to whatever he had been doing before. This was not that. What hit him when Isabella Swan walked through that doorway was not the familiar, low-grade pull of human blood in proximity. It was something categorically different, something so far beyond his ordinary experience of thirst that the word itself felt inadequate. It was as if every cell in his body had simultaneously and unanimously decided that the source of that scent was the singular most important thing in the world, that every restraint he had built across 87 years of careful discipline was an obstacle rather than a structure, that the only meaningful action available to him was to close the distance between himself and the girl who had just sat down 2 feet away. He did not breathe. He locked every muscle in his body against the instinct screaming through it. He turned his face away from her with a deliberateness that cost him more effort than anything he had done in decades, and he sat with his hands flat on the lab table, and he counted seconds, and he did not kill her. It was the closest he had come to losing control since his first year, and he had not even seen her face yet. And in the minutes that followed, managing the biological emergency of her proximity, he also tried to do what he always did, which was to reach toward the mind of the person beside him and take the information available there. Not intrusively, not with a sense that he was doing something wrong, simply because it was automatic, the way one hears a voice in the same room without trying to. He reached toward the silence where her thoughts should have been. There was nothing. He almost lost his grip on his control entirely in that moment, and not because of the thirst, because in 87 years, in every room he had ever entered, in every crowd he had ever passed through, in every conversation he had ever monitored from the inside out, there had never been nothing. Everyone broadcast, everyone without exception. The particular frequency of each mind was as distinct as a face, and he'd been reading them his entire vampire existence, and there was not a single one that had ever been closed to him. Until her. The silence where Isabella Swan's thoughts should have been was so complete, so absolute, that it registered almost as a physical sensation. Not absence exactly, but a different kind of presence. A door that was simply, entirely closed. He focused harder, the way one might lean toward a sound that is almost too faint to hear, and found nothing. He tried again. Nothing. He redirected, checked whether his ability was functioning at all by sampling the thoughts of the students around him, finding them all immediately and unavoidably available, and then turned back to the girl beside him and found again that perfect and impossible silence. And he did not know what to do with this. He had no category for it. He survived the class period through an act of will that he would later describe to Carlyle as the most difficult thing he had done since returning from his vigilante years. He did not breathe. He did not move except when absolutely required. He did not look at her directly. He counted the minutes and he held every instinct down through sheer force of intention. And when the bell rang, he left the room with enough control still intact that no one saw anything unusual. Outside, in the rain, he breathed again, and the first coherent thought that assembled itself once the immediate emergency had passed was not about the thirst. It was about what the thirst meant. He had known, in a general way, that the existence he and his family maintained required constant vigilance. So he had known that the thirst was always present, that human blood always carried its particular appeal, that his history made complacency dangerous. He had understood all of this in the way one understands a structural fact about one's circumstances, something to be accounted for and managed, not something that threatened to dismantle everything at once. What the biology classroom had shown him was something different. It had shown him that his understanding was theoretical, that he had been safe not because of the strength of his control, but because he had not yet been genuinely tested. 87 years of discipline and one girl walking through a door had reduced it to a thing he was holding together with both hands. This was not a problem he could manage with better preparation, and this was not something that would improve with exposure, at least not quickly enough to matter. This was a structural incompatibility, the kind of thing that did not resolve, only persisted. Her blood called to him in a way that was specific to him and specific to her, la tua cantante. Carlyle would name it later that evening, and the naming of it helped locate it within the vocabulary of vampire knowledge, even as it did nothing to address the reality of it. She was his singer, the one whose blood appealed to him beyond all others, beyond all proportion, beyond the reach of 8 decades of carefully constructed restraint. And she was going to be his lab partner for the rest of the semester. He went to Alaska. He could not stay, could not return to that classroom and sit beside her again without being certain he could remain in control. And he was not certain. He was the opposite of certain. He left without telling his family more than the minimum required, drove north with the specific intention of putting as much physical distance as possible between himself and the source of an attraction that had, in the space of 45 minutes, reordered everything he believed about himself. It was in Alaska, during the 4 days he spent at Tanya's family's home, that the first version of what would eventually become a much larger and more consequential thought arrived. He was dangerous, not in the abstract, generalized way that he had been dangerous before. The ongoing management of a predator's nature in the proximity of prey. He was dangerous to her specifically, in a way that exceeded anything he had previously experienced or could fully control. The thirst was a factor he could not simply discipline away through effort and preparation. It was structural, it was permanent, and she did not know it existed. He came back to Forks because the curiosity was stronger than the fear, and he knew this even as he was driving south, and he was ashamed of it. He wanted to know why her mind was silent. He wanted to understand what she was, what made her different, what it meant that she alone of every human he had ever encountered could not be read. The intellectual pull was genuine, and the shame of it was genuine, because he knew that curiosity was not a sufficient reason to return to a situation he had just established he could not safely manage. He returned anyway, and standing outside the school on a Tuesday morning, having hunted more thoroughly in the previous 4 days than he had in any comparable period in recent memory, having fortified his control with every available resource, having made a private commitment to himself that he would sit beside her and simply not react, a second thought arrived, quieter than the first. He should not be here, not in Forks, not in that classroom, not in proximity to a human being whose blood had already shown him exactly what he still was beneath all the careful architecture of the life he had constructed. The responsible choice, the choice Carlyle's philosophy pointed toward, even if Carlyle himself had not made it explicitly, was to remove himself, not to see how long his discipline would hold, not to treat her proximity as a test of his self-control, to simply not be there. He walked into the school. Home he sat in his assigned seat. He waited for her to arrive, and when she did, he turned his face away and held his breath and counted seconds. But the thought didn't leave. It had arrived, that quiet and reasonable and entirely ignored thought, and it would return. He did not know yet how many times it would return, or in what forms, or what it would eventually require of him. He only knew that it had found him, here in a biology classroom in Forks, Washington, in the particular shape of a girl with brown hair and a silent mind, and blood that called to him like nothing in 87 years of living had ever called before. He had made his choice for today. The thought waited with perfect patience for tomorrow. The decision to return to Forks had been made with his mind. Every morning after that, the decision to stay had to be made again, while with his body. This was the detail that Edward had not anticipated, and it was the one that would come to define the entire architecture of his time with Bella Swan before it ended. He'd expected the first day to be the hardest. He'd expected that exposure would function the way it functioned with other challenges, that proximity over time would dull the edge of the reaction, that his body would adjust and the thirst would recede to something more manageable, something closer to what he felt around every other human he had ever encountered. He had believed, because he needed to believe it, that the worst was behind him after that first biology class. He was wrong. Each morning began the same way. He was awake before the house stirred, before even Alice had risen to watch the shifting shapes of the day's possible futures. He lay in the stillness of his room and he made his calculations. How long since he had last hunted? Whether the reserves of his control were sufficient for another day in that classroom, beside that particular scent, managing that particular silence. Whether today was the day the careful structure he had built around her presence would finally fail. Most mornings, the answer to the last question was that he did not know, and not knowing was its own form of discipline, because it meant he could not relax, could not allow the vigilance to soften even slightly. Every day was the first day. Every day required the same preparation, the same commitment, the same deliberate act of choosing not to be what every instinct insisted he was. He hunted before school with a thoroughness that his siblings found excessive, and that he could not adequately explain without revealing more than he intended. Emmett occasionally joined him, drawn by the prospect of something larger than the usual quarry, and Edward was grateful for the company even as he kept his real reasons private. He needed to be as full as it was possible to be. He needed the thirst reduced to its lowest possible register before he walked through the doors of Forks High School, before he sat down in that familiar seat and waited for the particular sound of her heartbeat approaching down the hallway, because he could identify her heartbeat now. This was something new and unwelcome, this specific attunement to the particular rhythm of her pulse. Among the dozens of heartbeats that filled the school building, and among the overlapping sounds of hundreds of living bodies moving through their days, he had unconsciously learned hers, the precise tempo of it, the way it quickened when she was nervous or surprised, the slight change in its rhythm when she was concentrating hard on something, the way it slowed in the afternoons when the school day was ending, and whatever quiet anticipation she had carried through the morning hours had been spent. He had not chosen to learn this. His body had learned it without his permission, the way it had learned everything about her without his permission, cataloguing details he had never asked to keep and would not have known how to stop collecting even if he had tried. He noticed other things too, gathered through observation since her mind offered him nothing directly. She was left-handed, holding her pen at an angle that suggested she had always done it that way and had never been corrected. She chewed the inside of her lower lip when she was working through a problem, a small unconscious habit she was clearly unaware of. She finished lab assignments quickly, checked her work twice without being told to, and then looked out the window while she waited for the rest of the class to catch up. She did not enjoy being looked at. When anyone's attention landed on her too directly, something in her expression shifted, a slight withdrawal, as if she was stepping back inside herself to wait out the scrutiny. She was polite to everyone, and close to almost no one, maintaining a careful middle distance from the social world of the school that Edward recognized with uncomfortable familiarity as a strategy rather than a preference, while she was, he began to understand, someone who had spent a considerable amount of time managing her own presence so as not to impose it on others. This quality in her was so different from the ordinary self-absorption of the teenagers around her that it made her stand out in a way she would have hated had she been aware of it. She was trying to take up less space, and in doing so, she occupied a kind of negative space that drew the eye more than any amount of deliberate visibility would have. He watched all of this and collected all of it, carefully and without fully acknowledging why, because her mind gave him nothing, and so his eyes and his ears gathered what they could. It was a different kind of knowing than he was accustomed to, slower, incomplete, full of gaps that he could not simply reach across and fill. And he had spent 87 years knowing people from the inside out, understanding their fears and desires and secret shames before their faces had time to arrange themselves into expressions. He had never had to learn someone from the outside in. He had never had to work for it, to be patient with the incompleteness of what observation alone could offer. He was working for it now. He was being patient, and he had not yet allowed himself to think carefully about what this meant. The silence itself, that perfect and permanent silence where her thoughts should have been, had begun to do something to him that he had not predicted and could not entirely explain. He had lived with noise for 87 years. The particular noise of other minds, constant and unavoidable, and the thoughts of everyone around him arriving without invitation and departing without ceremony. He had developed elaborate systems for managing this, for tuning certain frequencies down without losing them entirely, for maintaining awareness without being consumed by it. But the effort was always there, running beneath everything else he did, an ongoing labor that had no rest and no end. Even among his own family, whose thoughts he had learned so thoroughly that they had become a kind of background hum rather than a foreground clamor, there was never true quiet. There was only the noise he had grown accustomed enough. To that, he stopped hearing it as noise. He had simply accepted this as the permanent condition of his existence and stopped expecting anything different. Bella Swan was different. When he was near her, the noise did not disappear entirely. The thoughts of every other person in the room continued to arrive as they always had. Mike Newton's persistent and irritating infatuation, Jessica Stanley's social calculations, the teacher's measured boredom with material he had explained 400 times. All of it continued. But there was a quality to the silence at her particular frequency, a kind of negative space that his attention kept returning to the way a tongue returns to the gap left by a missing tooth. It was not restful in the way silence is restful when there is genuinely nothing there. It was more specific than that. It was the silence of a closed door in a hallway of open ones, and something about the consistent presence of that closed door allowed him, paradoxically, to hear the rest of the noise more clearly, more manageably, and as if the one small stillness in his perceptual field gave him something to orient himself around. He did not tell anyone this. He was not certain he understood it well enough to explain it, and he suspected that explaining it would require admitting how much time he spent paying attention to her, which would require a conversation he was not ready to have with anyone, including himself. Alice watched him with the particular quality of attention she reserved for things she was seeing in pieces. Visions that kept shifting before she could hold them still. And he was careful not to give her more to look at than she already had. The days settled into their rhythm. Biology, the lab table, her heartbeat 2 feet away, his breath measured and shallow, enough to function, not enough to let her scent reach its full, overwhelming register. He began to speak to her in those weeks, small exchanges about the lab work, carefully neutral observations designed to produce responses he could study. Her voice, when it was directed at him, had a quality he had not expected. It was soft, but not hesitant. She said what she meant without ornamentation, without the social padding that most people wrap their words in to cushion the impact of actually communicating. He found this disarming in ways he did not fully understand, because he was accustomed to hearing what people meant beneath what they said, and she simply said what she meant, which made the gap he was accustomed to navigating disappear entirely. She was also, he began to notice, watching him. Not constantly, not with any particular agenda he could identify, but with the same quality of careful attention he was directing at her. When she thought he was not looking, her eyes would settle on him with a steadiness that suggested she was trying to work something out. He could not hear the working out. He could only see the expression that accompanied it, which was thoughtful and slightly puzzled, and entirely without the self-consciousness that usually accompanied the looks other students gave him. Most people who watched him were aware, on some level, that they were doing something transgressive. They knew the Cullens were strange. They knew staring was impolite. They managed the contradiction by keeping their attention brief and furtive, stealing glances rather than settling into genuine observation. Bella looked at him the way she looked at the lab slides under her microscope, with methodical focus and no apparent concern about whether the thing she was examining might look back. He did not know what to do with this either. The nights were a separate problem entirely. He had started following her home from school in those first weeks, staying several car lengths back, watching her ancient truck navigate the familiar roads to the small house where Chief Swan waited each evening with the particular thoughts of a father who had learned to manage his worry through routine. Edward had told himself this was protective surveillance, that the girl who had walked into his biology class and immediately become the most endangered person in his proximity deserved whatever additional safety he could provide without her knowledge. He had believed this justification, more or less, for approximately 4 days, but by the 5th day, he understood that the justification was not the reason. The reason was simpler and less defensible. When she was out of his sight, he was aware of her absence in a way that interfered with his concentration. His attention kept drifting toward the direction of her house, toward the question of whether she had arrived home safely, whether she had eaten dinner, whether the truck had broken down somewhere on the route, and she was standing alone in the rain, waiting for help, that did not know she needed it. These were not thoughts he had chosen to think. They arrived the way her particular absence arrived, which was to say without his permission, and they did not leave when he tried to redirect them towards something more appropriate. So he followed her, not every day at first, and then every day, and then, not only to her house, but back again after dark. When Chief Swan's patrol car was in the driveway, and the lights in the upper windows had gone out one by one, and the house had settled into the particular silence of a small building holding its sleeping occupants. He would climb to the tree outside her bedroom window and sit in the particular stillness that only vampires can manage, perfectly motionless, his weight distributed across the branch with an unconscious precision that left it undisturbed, and he would listen to her breathe. He knew with full clarity that this was wrong. He did not lack the self-awareness to recognize what he was doing and what it meant about the state of his control. He was not confused about whether nighttime surveillance of a sleeping girl constituted appropriate behavior. He knew that it did not, and he knew that Carlyle, if he had been aware of it, would have counseled him gently but unmistakably to stop. He knew that the same discipline he applied every day in that biology classroom, the careful management of impulse, the insistence on choosing correctly despite the cost, should have been applied here, at this window, in these hours. He did not stop. What he found at her window in those long, quiet hours between midnight and dawn was a version of the same thing he found in biology, but deeper and stranger and more difficult to justify away. Not peace exactly, because the thirst was still present, because her scent reached him even through the glass and the wood, because nothing about his proximity to her was ever truly peaceful, but something adjacent to peace, something that did not have a clean name in the vocabulary he had assembled across his existence, a quality of stillness that he did not experience anywhere else, not in the wilderness during a hunt, not in the late hours at the piano when the house was quiet, not in any of the places he had previously understood as refuges. He would sit in the tree and listen to her breathe, and for those hours the endless noise of other minds fell away to its furthest register, manageable and distant, and there was only this, the steady rhythm of her heartbeat, the sound of her turning in her sleep, the rustle of fabric, the small adjustments of a body finding its way through a dream, the occasional murmured fragments of whatever was moving through her sleeping mind, surface sounds without content, words that arrived already dissolved, and he could not hear the content of her dreams any more than he could hear her waking thoughts. She was as close to him unconscious as she was awake. But sometimes she spoke, small, incomplete phrases that surfaced and dissolved without context, and he catalogued these the way he catalogued everything else about her, adding them to the incomplete portrait he was assembling from everything she inadvertently offered. One night, early in these vigils, she said his name, just his name, quietly, in the particular soft register of deep sleep, with an expression that moved across her face in the darkness like light moving across water, brief and unguarded, and gone before he could fully identify what it meant. He did not know what the dream contained. He did not know whether the context was pleasant or frightening or something else entirely, something that had no clean category. He only knew that his name had been in her sleeping mind, and the knowledge of it sent him out of the tree and running into the forest with a speed that was less measured than he would have preferred, putting miles between himself and the thing he had just heard because he did not yet have a framework for what to do with it, and the absence of a framework in that particular moment felt genuinely dangerous. He came back the next night, and the night after that. This pattern, the knowing and the continuing anyway, was becoming familiar. He knew the nighttime visits were wrong, and he continued them. He knew that the attachment forming in him was dangerous, and he continued to allow it to form. He knew that every day he stayed in Forks, every day he sat beside her in biology and followed her home and watched her sleep, was a day in which the thing he was trying to manage was growing larger rather than smaller. The thirst was not diminishing. The silence was not becoming less compelling. The incomplete portrait he was assembling was not becoming less important to him with time and familiarity. Everything was moving in the wrong direction, toward more rather than less, toward deeper rather than shallower, and he was choosing it every morning with full knowledge of what he was choosing. He had told himself in Alaska that the curiosity about her silent mind was the reason he could not stay away. This was true as far as it went. The mystery of it was genuine. The intellectual pull of an impossibility he had never encountered real and significant. But he understood, at sitting in the tree outside her window on a night in February, while Forks slept around them, that the curiosity had long since become the smaller part of what held him here. Port Angeles arrived on a Saturday in March, with the particular quality of Forks weather that made every day feel interchangeable, grey and close and damp. Alice had come to him that morning with the particular urgency she reserved for futures that were still shifting, still undetermined, still capable of going in directions she could not fully see. A group of men. Bella separated from her friends in an unfamiliar part of the city. The specific kind of danger that required no supernatural element to be real and catastrophic. He had driven to Port Angeles without examining too carefully why Alice's vision had produced in him an immediate and complete inability to consider any other course of action. He had told himself it was logical. He was the most capable protection available. His speed and his strength and his ability to read approaching threats through the thoughts of those who harbored them made him uniquely suited to this particular task. All of this was true. None of it was the real reason. And he knew this, and he drove to Port Angeles anyway and parked where he could track her movements through the second-hand perception of every mind in her vicinity. He built a map of her progress through the city from the thoughts of strangers who passed her, glimpsing her through their eyes in fragments, and the patchwork portrait of someone seen from every angle but his own. She was in a bookstore, browsing with the focused patience of someone who knew what they were looking for. She was walking, checking her watch, calculating how much time remained before she was expected back. She was making a wrong turn, and then another, and then the thoughts he had been monitoring at the periphery of his attention sharpened into something that required no further interpretation. He was already moving. He reached her in the industrial section of the city, where the streets were quiet in the wrong way, pulled the Volvo around, with a precision that was not quite human, and did not need to be, and said 2 words. She got him without hesitation, and the trust was so immediate and so total that it registered in him as something he would not be able to stop thinking about later. The way she had looked at him in the moment before she moved, as if the calculation she was making had already been completed before she began it. What he wanted to do, in the seconds between understanding what the men had intended and getting her safely into the car, was to go back. The rage that had moved through him in those seconds was unlike anything he had felt in a very long time. clean and absolute and completely indifferent to the careful arguments about control and consequence that ordinarily governed him. He wanted to find each of those men and ensure with permanent thoroughness that they never considered doing this to anyone again. He wanted to be, for a very specific and targeted period of time, the thing he had spent decades trying not to be. Bella's hand on his arm held him. Not her words, though she spoke, though her voice in those first minutes in the car was shaking and then steadying itself with a determination he recognized and could not help but admire. It was the physical fact of her touch. Warm fingers on his cold forearm, contact that was more grounding than it had any right to be, pulling him back from the edge of himself with a force she was entirely unaware she possessed. At the restaurant, watching her eat, watching the color return slowly to her face and her hands stop their faint trembling, he understood something that the previous weeks of careful and willfully unexamined observation had been building toward the entire time. This was not curiosity. This had not been curiosity for quite some time. What he felt for Isabella Swan had crossed some boundary he could not precisely locate and could not uncross, and it had done so without his awareness and certainly without his consent. And the Port Angeles evening had simply made it impossible to maintain the fiction that he was here for intellectual reasons, that he was studying a puzzle, that the attachment was contained and manageable and would not complicate anything. He drove her home in the rain and walked her to the door and stood in the dark after she had gone inside, listening to her heartbeat settle back toward its ordinary rhythm through the walls of the house. Charlie's thoughts moved through their evening routine, unaware of how the night had differed from any other night, unaware of how close the evening had come to a different kind of ending. And the thought arrived again. Had the one that had first come to him in a biology classroom and then in Alaska, and then outside her house on a Tuesday evening, and now here, wearing the particular weight of Port Angeles on top of everything else that had accumulated before it. He was not good for her. This was not a new conclusion. But Port Angeles had added a dimension to it that the previous weeks had not fully supplied. He was not only a danger to her through his own nature, through the thirst and its potential for catastrophic loss of control. He was a danger because of what his world was, what it attracted, what it did to the humans who came close enough to become visible within it. He had been so focused on the internal threat, on managing the monster within, that he had not sufficiently accounted for the external one. His presence near her was not a private risk between the two of them. It was an exposure. It announced her to a world that had no safe place for her. He stood in the rain and he held his thought and did not look away from it, which was new. He'd been looking away from versions of it since the beginning. He had been managing it, deferring it, filing it in the category of things he would address eventually, when the situation was clearer, when he had more information, when he was more certain. Port Angeles had made him more certain, not with finality, not yet, but the thought that had been patient for weeks was becoming less patient. It was beginning to ask for more than acknowledgement. It was beginning to ask for an answer. He went home and he told Carlyle he needed to tell her the truth, and that she had noticed too much and was already searching for explanations and deserved to find the real one rather than a wrong one. This was true. It was also the thing he told himself to explain a decision whose deeper motivation he was not yet willing to name aloud. If she knew the truth and chose to leave, the choice would be hers, and he would not have to make it himself. He took her to the meadow and told her everything. And she looked at him sparkling in the fractured sunlight, and she said the word beautiful, and she stayed. She stayed, and the thought that had been asking for an answer went quiet for a while. But it did not go away. It never went away. It simply waited, with the particular patience of something that already knows how the story ends, for the next piece of evidence to arrive. And Edward, who planned everything, and who calculated everything, who had spent 87 years applying his formidable analytical mind to the problem of his own existence, was already, without fully knowing it, beginning to plan. There was a particular cruelty to Edward's gift that he had never found a way to fully articulate, even to himself. It was not simply that he heard what people thought. It was that he heard what they thought about him, about the choices he made, about the life he was trying to build, in real time, without the buffer of translation or the mercy of uncertainty. Most people move through their relationships with some degree of protective ignorance. They suspected what their family members felt, inferred it from behavior and expression and the careful architecture of what was left unsaid. They did not know. Edward always knew. And knowing, without being asked, without the possibility of looking away, was a form of intimacy that could not be undone and could not be reciprocated, and it made every relationship he had ever had into something fundamentally asymmetrical in ways he had long since stopped expecting to resolve. With his family, this asymmetry had settled over the decades into something manageable. He knew their thoughts the way he knew the particular sounds of the house settling at night, pervasively and automatically, without needing to actively attend to them. He had learned to receive this knowledge without being destabilized by it, to hold Rosalie's resentment and Emmett's ease, and Alice's flickering anticipation and Jasper's vigilance all simultaneously without letting any one of them pull him off balance. It was not comfortable exactly, but it was familiar, and familiarity had its own kind of comfort. What he had not accounted for was how completely Bella's presence would change the content of what he was hearing. From the day she first came to the Cullen house, from the afternoon, they had all sat in the living room and performed the careful theatre of a normal family meeting. The internal referendum on Isabella Swan had begun. Not maliciously, not with any intention to harm. His family did not choose to think what they thought any more than he chose to hear it, but thought they did, constantly and without the self-censorship that speech required. And Edward received it all with the same involuntary completeness with which he had always received everything. Rosalie's thoughts were the loudest, and not because she was the most certain, but because her certainty came wrapped in the specific frequency of old grief, and old grief carried farther than almost anything else. She did not dislike Bella as a person. This was the detail that made it harder rather than easier. The fact that what Rosalie felt was not contempt or jealousy in any simple form, but something more layered and more painful to witness. She looked at Bella, and she saw the thing she had lost. She saw someone young and warm and entirely mortal, moving through her days with the unconscious ease of someone who has never been required to account for her own humanity, because it has never been threatened. She saw someone who would age, who would change, who carried within her the full ordinary arc of a human life. And she saw this being risked and being offered up casually to a world that had taken Rosalie's own equivalent offering without her consent and without apology. Edward heard this every day, not in those precise words, because thought did not arrange itself into precise words the way speech did. It arrived in images and feelings and half-formed sentences that he translated automatically, the way one translates a language learned young enough that the translation itself becomes invisible. He heard Rosalie's grief and her anger, and underneath both of them, persistent and quiet and almost entirely suppressed, a kind of desperate longing that she would never have allowed herself to express aloud. She wanted what Bella had. She wanted it back with an intensity that had not diminished across the decades of her immortal existence. And watching Bella move through the Cullen house, and alive and temporary and completely unaware of what she possessed, was a daily renovation of a wound that had never properly healed. Edward could not silence this. He could not argue with it, or correct it, or explain it away. He could only receive it, day after day, and hold it alongside everything else he was carrying. One more weight in a structure that was already heavier than he generally allowed himself to acknowledge. Jasper was a different concern entirely, and in some ways, a more immediately practical one. Edward had always been aware of Jasper's particular difficulty. Among all of them, Jasper had come to this life latest, had spent the longest portion of his vampire existence on the other side of the choice they had all made, feeding on human blood without restraint, leading armies of newborns through the chaos of the Southern Vampire Wars with a ruthlessness that the gentle, careful man he had become still carried the memory of. The thirst was harder for him than for any of them. This was simply true, not a judgment, not a failure. It was the condition of his history and the particular sensitivity of his gift, which made him feel not only his own desire, but the desire of everyone around him, creating a feedback loop of temptation that required constant and exhausting management. Edward heard the management. That was the thing that people who did not share his gift could not fully understand. He did not simply know, in the abstract, that Jasper struggled. He heard the struggle in real time, felt the shape of it in Jasper's thoughts throughout every day, every meal, every family gathering. He knew which moments were harder. He knew when Jasper's control was solid, and when it was something he was holding together with focused intention, rather than genuine ease. He knew, with a specificity that was sometimes difficult to bear, exactly how much effort it cost his brother to be in the same room as a living, breathing, warm-blooded human girl whose heart was audible from across the house. And Bella did not know any of this. She sat at the dining room table and smiled at Jasper with the open, unguarded warmth she gave everyone she had decided to trust. And Jasper smiled back with the composed, careful expression he had learned to maintain regardless of what was happening beneath it. And Edward sat between them and heard both sides of an exchange that was nothing like what it appeared to be from the outside. He was not afraid that Jasper would hurt her deliberately. He knew Jasper well enough, had heard enough of his thoughts over enough years, to understand that Jasper's commitment to this life was genuine and deep. But deliberate harm was not the only category of risk. He knew, because he heard it, that there were moments when Jasper's control was a matter of active and ongoing effort, rather than settled habit, and that those moments could be triggered by things as small and as unavoidable as a change in the air, a door opening, a shift in the wind, the particular way blood moved just beneath the surface of human skin when our heart rate elevated. These were not hypothetical risks. They were operational ones, and Edward held them alongside everything else, quietly, without burdening Bella with the knowledge of them, because telling her would have required explaining the full extent of what she was walking into every time she entered this house. Alice's relationship to all of this was the most complicated to navigate, because Alice was both a source of reassurance and a source of a very specific kind of dread. Her visions were real. This was not in question. Alice saw things that happened, futures that arrived with the precision she had promised them. Edward trusted her gift more than almost any other fixed point in his existence, trusted it as a structural feature of the world he moved through rather than simply as a useful additional sense. When Alice saw something, he attended to it with a seriousness he reserved for very few things. But he also heard her uncertainty. He heard in the texture of her thoughts and the places where her vision became less reliable, where the images blurred or fractured or failed to arrive at all. He heard her frustration with the specific blurriness that surrounded Bella, the way Bella's future kept sliding out of focus in ways that Alice could not fully explain. He heard her working around this limitation, extrapolating from the futures of people adjacent to Bella when Bella's own future refused to resolve, building a picture from the edges inward. He knew what Alice could not see as clearly as he knew what she could, and what she could not see reliably and consistently was Bella. This meant that the early warning system he had come to depend on had a specific and permanent gap in it. Alice could not always tell him when Bella was in danger until the danger was already immediate. She could not give him the lead time that might make the difference between a catastrophic outcome and a prevented one. She could show him probabilities and tendencies and the trajectories of other people's choices. But the center of the picture, the part that mattered most, was the part that kept going soft. He held this knowledge too. He had held it from early in their time in Forks, had filed it in the same category as everything else he was managing, had told himself that his own vigilance could compensate for the gap Alice's visions left. He had believed this because he had needed to believe it, because the alternative was an admission he was not yet ready to make. Carlyle's position in all of this was the one that cost Edward the most to hold, and he held it every day regardless of the cost, because Carlyle's thoughts were the ones he most respected and least wanted to disagree with. Carlyle believed in them. This was the simple and devastating fact at the center of his thoughts whenever they turned to Edward and Bella, which they did with the frequency of genuine parental concern, combined with genuine parental hope. He believed that what Edward had found was real, that it mattered, that the impossibility of it was not an argument against it, but rather evidence of its significance. He had seen enough of Edward's hollow decades, had watched his son move through the years with a particular emptiness of someone who has stopped expecting anything from the future, and he felt something very close to joy at the evidence that expectation had returned. Edward heard this joy. He heard the sincerity of it, and the complete absence of performance or qualification. Carlyle was not hoping for the best while privately suspecting the worst. He genuinely believed that a life which included Bella was possible, that the risks were manageable, that love was not a reason to leave but a reason to stay and work harder. This made disagreeing with him more painful than anything else in Edward's daily experience, because he could not dismiss Carlyle's optimism as naivety. Carlyle was not naive. He was 360 years old, and had seen more of what immortal existence could contain than almost any other vampire alive, and his hope was the hope of someone who had earned it through experience, rather than someone who had never been tested. To disagree with Carlyle was to disagree not with ignorance, but with wisdom, and Edward was not certain he had sufficient grounds for it, which meant he could not resolve the disagreement cleanly in either direction. He could only hold it. Carlyle's hope on one side and his own accumulating evidence on the other, unreconciled, both of them present every day, both of them real. Esme's thoughts were softer, but no less present. She'd begun, very early, and with the wholehearted commitment she brought to everything she loved, to think of Bella as family, not as a visitor or complication or problem to be assessed, as a daughter with all the warmth and all the worry that implied. She thought about Bella's safety with the specific texture of maternal fear, checked in on Alice's visions for news of her, noticed when Edward seemed more troubled, and traced the trouble back to its source with the quiet accuracy of someone who had been paying attention to him for decades. He was grateful for Esme's love and burdened by it simultaneously, because her love for Bella made the weight of what he was beginning to consider heavier. Every person in this family who had opened themselves to Bella was another person who would bear the cost of whatever decision he ultimately made. He was not the only one in this equation, and he had never been, and the referendum he was living inside every day was not only about Bella's safety, it was about the integrity of the life they had all built together, and what it could and could not withstand. Move through all of this every day, hearing it all, holding it all, in managing the immense internal architecture of a situation that grew more complicated with each week that passed. He attended to Carlyle's hope and Rosalie's grief, and Jasper's vigilance, and Alice's uncertain sight, and Esme's maternal warmth, and he carried all of it alongside his own feelings, which he was becoming less able to classify in terms that felt adequate. And beneath it all, steady and patient, and increasingly difficult to defer, the thought continued its quiet insistence. He could not protect her from the risks within his own family any more than he could protect her from himself. He had believed, when he returned from Alaska, that his control was the primary variable, that if he could manage his own thirst, the rest could be managed around it. But the family he lived inside, and the family he could hear every day from the inside out, was telling him something different. The risks were not only his to manage, they were distributed across every person in that house, across the specific vulnerabilities and histories and ongoing struggles of 5 other vampires who were each, in their own way, trying to do the same thing he was. And the question that had begun as a whisper in a biology classroom was becoming, slowly and inevitably, something that required more than acknowledgement. It was becoming a plan. Bella's 18th birthday arrived the way all unwanted things arrive, with complete indifference to whether anyone was ready for it. Edward had been dreading it for weeks. Not in the way one dreads an unpleasant obligation, not with the low-grade reluctance of someone anticipating discomfort. He had been dreading it with a specific focused anxiety of someone who understands that a particular date on the calendar represents more than a social occasion, that it carries within it a set of implications that cannot be decorated away with streamers and cake and Alice's relentless organizational enthusiasm. The birthday meant she was 18. He was, and would remain forever, 17. This gap had existed from the beginning technically, but it had been abstract until now, a numerical fact without emotional weight. Once she turned 18, it became concrete. She was older than him. She would continue to age. Every birthday that followed would widen the distance between what she was becoming and what he would always be. And there was only one way to stop that widening. And he had very complicated feelings about that way. And the birthday party was not the place to address any of them. There was also the other thing. The thing beneath the symbolic discomfort. The practical reality that a birthday meant gifts, and gifts meant wrapping paper, and wrapping paper meant edges, and edges meant the possibility of cuts, and cuts meant blood, and blood in a house full of vampires was not a theoretical problem. It was an operational one. He had raised this concern with Alice in the weeks before, carefully, and without wanting to seem like he was opposing the celebration she had been planning with visible joy since August. Alice had listened and nodded, and adjusted certain elements of the party and assured him that everything would be fine. And he had heard in her thoughts the genuine confidence behind the assurance, which helped somewhat, and the persistent blur around Bella's immediate future in her visions, which did not help at all. He had spent the 2 weeks before the birthday hunting with an intensity that went beyond his ordinary preschool preparation. He was not simply managing his daily thirst. He was building reserves, stockpiling control, trying to arrive at the party in the most fortified state he could construct through sheer biological saturation. Emmett had joined him twice and remarked, with a particular brand of cheerful directness that was his signature, that Edward was hunting like someone who expected a war. Edward had not corrected him. The evening of September 13th arrived grey and cool. The sky doing what the Forks sky did in September, which was to say it was heavy and low and indifferent to the occasion beneath it. Edward picked Bella up from Charlie's house, and she was quiet in the car, which was not unusual, but the quality of her quiet was different that evening. He could not hear her thoughts, had never been able to hear her thoughts, but he had become, across months of careful observation, reasonably skilled at reading the physical signatures of her emotional states. Her hands in her lap were slightly tense. Her gaze was directed out the passenger window rather than at him. She was managing something, and managing it with her characteristic determination to appear as though there was nothing to manage. He wanted to ask. He did not ask, because asking would require her to either tell him the truth, which would lead to a conversation about aging and immortality that he did not want to have in the car on the way to her birthday party, and or to tell him she was fine, which he would know immediately was not true, and then they would both be sitting with the knowledge of the untruth between them, which was worse than the silence. So they drove in silence to the house, and the house was lit and beautiful in the way Esme always made things lit and beautiful, and Alice appeared at the door before they reached it, with the barely contained energy of someone who had been watching this moment approach in her visions for weeks, and was deeply satisfied to see it arriving as planned. Edward heard the family as they entered, Alice's delight, genuine and uncomplicated, the particular pleasure she took in creating occasions for the people she loved. Emmett's easy warmth, already preparing the particular brand of teasing affection he reserved for moments meant to be sentimental. Esme's maternal happiness, quiet and deep. The joy of having everyone gathered. Carlyle's calm contentment, watching his family with the satisfaction of someone who has spent 3 centuries wanting exactly this and still finds it remarkable when it exists. Jasper stood near the back of the room, and Edward heard him before he saw him clearly. The management was in place, solid and practiced, the careful control that Jasper brought to every encounter with Bella. But Edward heard the effort behind it, the active, ongoing work of it, and he calibrated his own position in the room accordingly, placing himself close enough to intervene quickly if the effort became insufficient. This was automatic now. He did it without thinking, the way one steps around a familiar obstacle in the dark. Rosalie's thoughts were cooler, as they always were in Bella's presence, but she was present and she was civil, and this, from Rosalie, constituted a significant act of generosity that Edward acknowledged privately, even as he did not comment on it. Bella moved through the early part of the evening with the visible discomfort of someone who does not enjoy being celebrated, who finds the focused attention of a room full of people on her behalf more exhausting than pleasurable. She accepted the greetings and the warmth with genuine appreciation and simultaneous relief whenever attention shifted away from her. Edward stayed close, monitoring everything, tracking variables the way he'd been tracking them all evening, all week, all the weeks leading up to this night. The gifts were Alice's particular insistence. Bella had objected to gifts. Ike had made her feelings about receiving them known with the quiet firmness she brought to preferences she actually cared about. And Alice had overridden her objections with cheerful, unapologetic authority and arranged a small collection of wrapped packages on the table near the window. Edward watched these packages with an attention he did not attempt to justify. They were paper and ribbon, ordinary objects. He was aware of this. He was also aware that paper had edges. Bella approached the table with the resigned expression of someone who has lost an argument they knew they would lose from the beginning. She reached for the first package, a flat envelope from Carlyle and Esme, the kind with a tucked flap rather than a sealed one, which Edward had registered with relief. She slid her finger under the flap. The sound was very small, in the kind of sound that, in any other context, in any room in the world that did not contain 6 vampires, would have registered as nothing. A whisper of paper against skin, a breath of a thing. The scent arrived in the same instant. Edward had been prepared. He had told himself he was prepared, had constructed the preparation across weeks of deliberate effort, had arrived at this room in the most fortified state available to him. And for the space of 1/2 second the preparation held, his body responding to the scent with the trained recognition of something to be managed rather than pursued. Then he heard Jasper's thoughts, and everything changed. It was not a thought in the organized sense, not a sentence or an image or anything that could be neatly translated. It was a shift in register, sudden and total, and the particular quality of a mind moving from controlled vigilance into something older and more immediate. Edward had heard this shift before, in other contexts, In the early years when Jasper's control was newer and less reliable, and he recognized it the way one recognizes the specific sound of something structural giving way. He was already moving before his conscious mind had finished processing what he was hearing. Not toward Bella, not to reach for her in the way that instinct demanded. Away from her, interposing himself, getting his body between Jasper's trajectory and the source of the scent with a speed that required him to make contact more forcefully than he intended. His hands found her shoulders and he pushed, not gently, not with the careful calibration he used when he was managing his own strength around her fragility. He pushed with the speed that the situation required, and she went backward, and the table went with her, and the sound of crystal shattering filled the room. He heard her hit the table, and he heard the crystal break, and he heard, beneath both of those sounds, the change in her heartbeat that told him she had been hurt before he could see the injury. The glass. There was glass, and she had gone into it, and the cut that resulted was not the small whisper of a paper edge, but something more, and the scent that followed was not a whisper either. The room changed in the way that rooms change when something that was being held back stops being held back. Edward heard it in every mind simultaneously. The involuntary response, the thirst spiking across the room like a wave hitting a shore, each of them managing it from wherever they were, with whatever reserve of control the evening had left them. Jasper was furthest from managed. Edward turned with Emmett already moving to contain the situation, already at Jasper's side, the two of them between Jasper and Bella, with the automatic coordination of people who have practiced this, who have talked about what to do if this happened, who have always known on some level that this was a possibility rather than a hypothetical. Carlyle was at Bella's side. Edward heard his thoughts shift into the particular focused calm of medical assessment, the part of Carlyle that had been a physician longer than most countries had existed, taking over with practiced efficiency. The injury was real. The blood was real. Carlyle's control was what it always was, which was to say the product of 3.5 centuries of deliberate refinement, and it held, and he began to address the wound with the quiet competence that had always been one of the things Edward admired most in him. Edward stood between Bella and the rest of the room and breathed, and the breathing cost him, and he paid the cost because there was no other available option. And he listened to Carlyle reassure her in the gentle, unhurried voice he used when he was managing both a patient's injury and their fear simultaneously. He listened to Bella insist she was fine in the specific way she always insisted she was fine, which was without particular reference to whether she was actually fine. He walked her home afterward, because the evening was over in every way that mattered, and there was no version of continuing it that made sense. They walked in the dark, and she talked with a slightly too bright energy of someone processing a difficult experience by moving past it quickly, and he walked beside her and said what was required and heard nothing of what was happening inside her, because he never heard anything of what was happening inside her. What was happening inside him was another matter. He was conducting, as he walked, the most thorough audit he had performed since the first days after biology, not of his thirst, which was present and accounted for as always, not of his control, which had held this evening at significant cost. He was auditing the evening as evidence. He was looking at what had happened not as an instant, but as a data point, placing it in the context of everything that had preceded it, asking what it told him about the situation he was in and the direction it was moving. What it told him was this: he had spent months managing variables. He had identified the risks and addressed them with preparation and vigilance and the accumulated discipline of 87 years of careful living. He had believed because the belief was necessary to sustain the choice he was making every day, that the management was sufficient, that sufficient preparation, sufficient control, sufficient love constituted enough. The birthday party had shown him the limit of sufficient, not because his control had failed. His control had not failed, but Jasper's had come close. And close was not a category that left room for comfort when the thing being protected was a human girl in a room full of vampires responding to her blood. He had thrown her into a table. He had injured her while trying to protect her. He had stood in a room full of people who loved her, all of them fighting the desire to hurt her, and the fight had been real, and the outcome had been fortunate, and fortunate was not the same as safe. He left her at her door and stood in the dark outside Charlie's house, and the thought that had been patient for months was patient no longer. This had been going to happen. Not this specific incident, not on this specific evening, but something of this category had always been going to happen, because the conditions that produced it had never changed. She was human. They were vampires. The thirst did not diminish with familiarity or love or good intentions. It was structural, and structural problems did not resolve through effort alone, and they required structural solutions. He had known this. He had known it from the biology classroom, had known it in Alaska, had known it in all the quiet iterations of the thought that had been visiting him for months. He had deferred the knowledge because deferring it allowed him to stay, and staying was what he had wanted, with a completeness of wanting that he had not experienced in his long existence, and the wanting had been real and had been worth something, and had not been enough. He did not go to her window that night. He stood outside in the dark for a long time, and then he went home, and he sat in his room, and for the first time since the thought had first arrived, he did not push it away. He let it stay. He looked at it fully, and without the deflection and the deferral and the elaborate architecture of justification he had been constructing around it for months. He let it be what it was, which was a conclusion rather than a fear, a destination he had been moving toward without acknowledging the direction of his travel. She was not safe with him. She was not safe with his family. The love was real, and the danger was real, and the love did not cancel the danger, had never cancelled it, had only made the danger more complicated to see clearly, because he had not wanted to see it. He needed to leave, not impulsively, not in reaction to this single evening, but with the same deliberateness he had brought to everything else in his long existence. He needed to plan it carefully, to construct it in a way that would actually work, and that would give her a genuine chance at the life she deserved, rather than simply removing his presence and leaving her suspended in grief. He needed to do it right, which meant he needed to think. He began to think. The days after the birthday party had a different quality than the days before it. Something had settled, and the settling was not relief. Edward moved through the house with the same surface composure he always maintained, the careful performance of normalcy that had become so habitual over the decades that he could sustain it without conscious effort, freeing the part of his mind that actually required his attention for the work that was now occupying it almost entirely. He hunted. He sat through the school day. He drove his siblings home. He did the things that constituted his visible existence with the mechanical reliability of someone whose real activity is happening elsewhere, in a quieter and less observable place. He was planning, not yet in the specific sense of dates and logistics and the precise words he would need to say. That came later. What he was doing in those first days after the birthday was something more foundational. The work that has to happen before planning can begin, which is the work of allowing a conclusion to be a conclusion, rather than continuing to treat it as a question. He had spent months with the question. The birthday party had not given him a new answer. It had simply made the existing answer too large to keep filing away. She was not safe with him. This was the conclusion. He returned to it from different angles in those days, and testing it against the various counter-arguments he had been living inside for months, and each time he returned to it, it held. It was not a fear or a feeling or a worst-case interpretation of ambiguous evidence. It was a structural fact about the situation he and Bella existed in, and it had been a structural fact from the beginning, and he had known it and chosen, for reasons he understood and did not entirely regret, to defer acting on it. The deferral was over. He went to Carlisle on the third day after the birthday. Not impulsively, not in the way of someone who needs to speak before they have finished thinking. He went when he was ready, when the conclusion was sufficiently solid that it could withstand the conversation he knew was coming. When he was certain enough of his own position that Carlisle's response, whatever it was, I would not dismantle it. He found Carlisle in his study, surrounded by the particular organized density of books and papers that had characterized every room Carlisle had used as a workspace across the decades. The desk lamp cast its usual warm light across the stacks, and the room smelled of old paper and the specific quietness of a space that had been used for serious thought over a long period of time. Carlisle looked up when Edward appeared in the doorway, and his expression shifted in the way it shifted when he was reading Edward's emotional state through observation rather than conversation. He could not hear Edward's thoughts. None of them could hear each other's thoughts, with the singular exception of Edward's gift running in one direction only. But Carlisle had known him for nearly 90 years, and 90 years of careful attention had given him a vocabulary for Edward's face that was almost as accurate as telepathy. He knew something had changed. Edward heard the recognition arrive in his thoughts before either of them spoke. He heard Carlisle's immediate instinctive hope that whatever had changed was not what he suspected it was, and then the quiet settling of that hope as Edward came further into the room and Carlisle read the set of his expression more fully. He told Carlisle what he had concluded, not the history of arriving at it, not the months of accumulating evidence and suppressed acknowledgement and deferred decision, just the conclusion itself, stated plainly. Because Carlisle deserved plainness, and because Edward had spent enough time with the elaborate version to know that it was still the same conclusion, regardless of how carefully it was approached. He was going to leave. He was going to take the family and go, and he was going to do it in a way that was permanent rather than temporary, that closed the door rather than leaving it open for Bella to wait beside. Carlyle was quiet for a long moment after Edward finished. Not the quiet of someone who has not heard, or who is gathering arguments to dismantle what they have been told. The quiet of someone who has heard fully and is sitting with it, turning it carefully in their hands before deciding how to respond to something they do not agree with, but cannot dismiss as wrong. What followed was the most difficult conversation Edward had had in years, and the difficulty of it was located precisely in the fact that Carlyle was not arguing from ignorance or sentimentality. He was not a father panicking at the thought of losing something that made his son happy. He was arguing from 360 years of considered experience, from a philosophy he had built and rebuilt across the centuries and tested against conditions far more extreme than this one. And his position was not that the dangers Edward had identified were not real. It was that danger was not, in his view, sufficient reason to abandon something that had given Edward back a quality of existence that Carlyle had been watching him lack for decades. He said this carefully and at length, and with the particular patience of someone who knows their words are going to matter and wants to give them every possible chance to land correctly. He spoke about what he had observed in Edward across the months since January, the change in him that had been visible even without access to his thoughts, the re-engagement with the present, the sense of purpose that had replaced the hollow routine, the way Edward moved through days that he had previously merely endured. Carlyle named all of this with the quiet precision of someone who'd been paying close attention, and Edward heard the sincerity behind every word, which made listening to them cost more rather than less. Edward heard the argument in Carlyle's thoughts before he made it aloud, and then he heard it aloud as he held it with the genuine respect it deserved while understanding, with quiet certainty, that it did not change his conclusion. The love was real. He was not disputing that. The happiness was real. He was not pretending otherwise. But real love and real happiness existed alongside real danger, and the danger was not a side condition that could be managed indefinitely without cost. The birthday party had shown him the cost in the most concrete terms available, and the birthday party was one evening in a future that stretched forward without limit, full of other evenings, other incidents, other moments when the management would be tested and the outcome would depend on factors he could not control and had never been able to control. He could not make Jasper's history shorter than it was, or his gift less sensitive than it was. He could not make Bella's blood less compelling to any of them. He could not alter the fundamental nature of what his family was and what she was, and the incompatibility that existed between those two things, regardless of how much love was layered over it. Love was real and love was not sufficient. He had learned this across 90 years of trying to make things work through will and discipline and the most careful management he could devise. And the birthday party had been a demonstration of what happened when love and will and discipline encountered a moment that did not care about any of them. Carlyle listened to all of this. Edward heard his thoughts as he listened, the genuine grappling with the argument, the weighing of it against his own position, the honest acknowledgement that Edward's reasoning was coherent, even as he continued to believe a different conclusion was possible. Carlyle did not believe Edward was wrong about the risks. He believed Edward was making a real choice in response to real conditions, and his disagreement was not with the logic, but with the destination the logic was being used to reach. He believed there were other destinations available from the same starting point. He believed the situation was livable in ways Edward had decided it was not, and that the decision about whether it was livable was not Edward's alone to make. This was the argument that came closest to landing. That Bella had chosen this, had been given the information, and had made her own assessment of the risk, and had decided it was acceptable, that overriding her choice with his own was a form of control dressed in the language of protection. That love which expressed itself by removing the beloved's agency was not, in the end, an uncomplicated kind of love. Edward heard this and sat with it longer than he sat with the other arguments, because it was the truest one and the most uncomfortable one, and the one he had the least clean response to. He did not have a clean response. He had only his certainty, arrived at through months of evidence and sustained by the birthday party's demonstration of what he already knew, that her assessment of the risk was made without access to the information he had. She did not hear Jasper's thoughts. She did not know, in the specific and daily and granular way that he knew, how close any given moment might be to a different outcome, as she was making her choice from the outside, and he was making his from the inside, and the views from those two positions were not the same view. They did not resolve it. Edward had not expected to resolve it. He had come to tell Carlyle his decision, not to ask for permission or to submit his reasoning for approval. Carlyle's disagreement was painful in the specific way that disagreement with someone you deeply respect and love is always painful. And Edward held the pain with the same steadiness he was trying to bring to everything else, and did not allow it to alter his direction. He called the family together that evening. They gathered in the living room with a particular quality of attention that family meetings carried, everyone aware that something significant was being addressed, everyone's thoughts already moving toward their own predictions about what it would be. Edward felt the emotional texture of the room before anyone spoke. Jasper's empathic gift broadcasting it back to him in the slightly clarified form of something being actively monitored. Tension, apprehension, and from at least one direction, a quietly held anticipation that Edward recognized and did not comment on. He told them before he sat down. There was no useful way to build toward it. No arrangement of preliminary context that would make it easier to hear or easier to say. He was leaving Forks. They were all leaving Forks. He wanted them gone within the week. The response arrived in layers, each of them processing it through the lens of who they were and what they had been carrying since September 13th. Rosalie's thoughts moved first, and they moved in the direction Edward had anticipated, and that did not make it easier to witness. Relief was the primary note, genuine and immediate, rising before she had time to organize a more measured response. Beneath it was something more complicated, a kind of vindication inseparable from guilt, about feeling vindicated, and beneath that, quieter than either, a thread of genuine sorrow for Edward that she would not have chosen to feel but could not suppress. She had believed from the beginning that this was where it would end. She had said so in various forms and had been resented for saying so, and she took no pleasure in having been right. The relief was not pleasure. It was simply the involuntary response of someone who had been holding a fear for a long time, finally being allowed to set it down. Jasper's response was quieter and carried a different weight. Edward heard the military mind assessing, running the decision through the framework it applied to everything, cataloguing the variables and the likely outcomes with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been making tactical evaluations for far longer than this particular situation required. He agreed with the decision, not with enthusiasm or relief, but with a measured, sober acknowledgement of someone who had been aware of their own position as a liability and had never been entirely comfortable with it. He had nearly hurt her. The birthday party lived in his thoughts as a specific and unresolved failure of the control he prided himself on maintaining, and the knowledge of it had been sitting there since the evening it happened, unclean and direct, and not softened by the time that had passed. He did not argue. He simply agreed, and the agreement cost him something, and Edward heard the cost clearly. Emmett pushed back. This was not a surprise, but it was the response Edward found hardest to sit with in the moment, because Emmett's objections were not tactical or philosophical. They were personal and immediate and grounded in the specific texture of what these months had actually looked like from where Emmett stood. He did not want to go. He did not believe the conclusion was as inevitable as Edward was treating it. He thought one bad evening was being given more weight than the accumulated evidence of months of things going right, and he said so with the directness that was his fundamental character. Did not aggressively, but without the diplomatic softening that the others brought to difficult conversations. Edward heard the genuine objection in Emmett's thoughts, the frustration of someone who has watched something good exist and cannot understand the decision to end it preemptively, and he acknowledged it with the respect it deserved and did not change his mind. Esme did not argue and did not agree. Edward heard why, which was that she was doing what Esme always did, which was to hold everyone's pain simultaneously and try to be present to all of it without dismissing any piece of it. She was heartbroken in the specific way of someone who had loved Bella, not as an extension of her love for Edward, but in her own right, had claimed her quietly and completely in the way Esme claimed people she decided belonged to her. The knowledge of what this departure would do to Bella sat in her thoughts with a heaviness that made everything else in the room feel lighter by comparison. She trusted Edward's judgment. She did not believe his judgment was making him happy, or that it would make him happy going forward. She held both of these things with equal weight and said very little, because there was nothing to say that would address either of them adequately. Alice was last, and her response arrived differently from the others, because hers was not simply a reaction to what she was being told. It was a response to futures she had already been watching, images she had been sitting with since the birthday, visions she had been hoping would shift towards something that did not require her to deliver them. She shared one. Edward had asked, because he needed the cost to be specific rather than abstract, needed to look at what he was choosing with his eyes open rather than reasoning his way toward it, with his face turned away. She described what she saw with the careful and pained precision she reserved for visions she found genuinely difficult, and the images arrived in his mind through her words with the particular force of something rendered in detail. Bella, in the weeks after, not dramatic, not visibly broken in any way that would register from the outside as crisis. Subtler than that, and in some ways worse. The world continuing at its ordinary pace around her while she moved through it at a slight remove, present in every technical sense, going through the motions of each day with the focused determination she brought to everything she found difficult, and absent in the one sense that could not be compensated for by determination. The light that had been in her since January, not the happiness exactly, but the quality of engagement, the sense of someone who had found a reason to pay attention, simply not there. Edward received this vision and held it, and did not look away from it. He let it be as painful as it was, which was considerable, and then he returned, as he had been returning for days, to his conclusion. She would recover. He believed this with the same certainty he brought to the conclusion itself, grounded in his understanding of who she was, rather than in wishful thinking about how grief worked. She was young, and she was resilient, and she was, beneath the quiet reserve and the careful management of her own presence, someone with significant internal resources, that the grief would be real. It would be the kind of grief that left marks, and it would end, and on the other side of it was everything he could not provide, and that she had every right to have. The planning of the breakup itself occupied the evenings that followed the family meeting, not the logistics of the family's departure, which required minimal effort from him. The Cullens had rehearsed this transition enough times across the decades that it proceeded with the smooth efficiency of something thoroughly practiced. What required his attention, what he returned to again and again in the quiet hours when the rest of the house had stilled, was the construction of the words. He was not going to tell her the truth. This was a decision he had arrived at through the same analytical process he brought to everything, tested from multiple angles, and held with full awareness of what it meant about him that he was making it. A truthful goodbye would not accomplish what the goodbye was for. If he told her he loved her and was leaving because the world he came from was incompatible with her safety, she would wait. He knew this the way he knew the things about her that her silence had never prevented him from learning, through months of careful observation of someone whose behavior was, if not a perfect map of her inner life, at least a reliable guide to its most significant features. She would treat his departure as a sacrifice rather than a conclusion. She would hold the thread of it. She would not move forward, and the entire purpose of the departure was to allow her to move forward. The lie, then, not cruelty for its own sake. A mechanism, the specific tool required to make the leaving accomplish what the leaving was intended to accomplish. He needed to construct a narrative she would believe completely, one that left no thread she could hold on to, no door she could stand beside, waiting for it to open again. He needed her to believe he did not want her. He rehearsed in the silence of his room, testing each sentence against his incomplete but carefully assembled model of how she thought, how she processed, what she would question, and what she would accept as the explanation that made everything else make sense. He was working from the outside in, as he always had been with her, constructing from observation what he could not access directly, and it was slower and less certain than reading her thoughts would have been, and it was all he had. He said the words into the empty room and listened to them and found the places where they left openings, and he closed the openings and said them again. This was among the more extraordinary forms of suffering he had experienced in his existence, and his existence had contained genuine suffering in forms that were not metaphorical. He did not stop. He did not allow the suffering of the rehearsal to become a reason to reconsider the conclusion. because the suffering of the rehearsal was small compared to the suffering of the alternative, and he had done the calculation, and he knew which was larger. The school days continued. He sat beside her in biology, and he looked at her face, and he heard her heartbeat, and he rehearsed in the back of his mind, in the space her silence had always kept available, either words he was going to say in the woods behind her house on the day he had already chosen. He was not reacting to the birthday party. He had not been reacting since September 13th. What had happened that evening had not created this decision. It had completed it, had supplied the final weight to a structure that had been under construction since January, since a Monday when the air had changed and everything that followed had been, in some sense, always moving toward this. The woods were quiet at this time of year. He had walked them enough to know their particular quality of stillness in early autumn. The way sound moved through them, the way the light came down. He had chosen the location with the same deliberateness he had brought to everything else, because location mattered, because the setting of a thing shaped the experience of it, and he wanted to give her the cleanest possible version of what he was about to do, which meant thinking about every element with care. He was, in all the ways that mattered, already gone. He simply had not said so yet. And the saying of it, the execution of the plan he had been building since the conclusion had finally been allowed to be a conclusion, was now only a matter of choosing the morning and walking into the trees and being, for the last time, the person she thought he was. He chose a Thursday. There was no particular significance to the day. He had not selected it for symbolic reasons, or because the date held any meaning he wanted to attach to what he was about to do. He had chosen it because Alice's vision showed him the weather would be overcast but dry, because Charlie would be working a full shift, because the school day would end at the ordinary time, and he would have a window of several hours before anyone would expect either of them to be anywhere. Practical reasons. He was, at this point, operating almost entirely from the practical, having found that the practical was the only register in which he could continue to function without the weight of everything else making the functioning impossible. He had not slept, which meant nothing in the physiological sense, but everything in the experiential one. He had spent the night in his room, not at her window, not in the tree that had become so familiar over the months of his vigil that he could have found it in absolute darkness without any of his enhanced senses. He had stayed home deliberately. I had made the choice to spend this last night in his own space rather than hers, because going to her window would have made the morning harder, and the morning was already going to be the hardest thing he had done in a very long time. He'd spent the night with the words, running them one final time, not because they needed further refinement, but because repetition had become a kind of discipline, a way of keeping himself in the practical register and out of the one that would make it impossible to go through with what he had decided. He said them into the dark of his room with the same controlled flatness he would need to produce when he said them to her, and he listened to them, and they were right, and he did not allow himself to think about what right meant in this context, or the morning arrived in the particular grey way of Fawkes' mornings in September, the sky doing nothing dramatic, simply being overcast and indifferent, which suited the day better than any other weather would have. Edward drove to school with his siblings and sat through the first several periods with the automatic competence of someone whose body has performed these actions enough times that it no longer requires conscious direction. He heard the thoughts around him with the usual involuntary completeness and processed none of them. Alice sat beside him at lunch and did not speak, which was its own form of communication. She had seen the day, or pieces of it, enough to know what was coming and when. She did not try to change it. She had made her arguments in the family meeting and had not been persuaded to accept them. And Alice, if whatever her feelings, did not repeat herself endlessly. She simply sat beside him. In the silence there was the most honest expression of what she felt about the afternoon. Biology was last. He sat in the familiar seat at the familiar lab table, and Bella sat beside him with her familiar heartbeat and her familiar silence, and he looked at his hands on the tabletop and thought about nothing that was not the practical. The lab work, the handout, the instructions on the page. He moved through it with mechanical precision, and when she spoke he responded with the careful neutrality he had been practicing. Not cold enough to alarm her before the time, not warm enough to make what was coming feel like a greater reversal than it needed to feel. He was calibrating, still, right up to the end, managing the impression he was creating at the data she was receiving with the same meticulous attention he had brought to managing the impression of being human in every room he had occupied for 90 years. When the bell rang, he asked her to walk with him. She said yes without hesitation, and the ease of it, the trust that had never once required his justification, settled into his chest with the specific weight of something he was going to carry for a long time. They walked from the school toward her house and then past it, and she noted this with a glance but not a question. He had told her he wanted to show her something in the woods, something she would appreciate, and the lie had been small and easily delivered, and she had accepted it with the quiet willingness she brought to most things he suggested, and which was another weight he was collecting as they walked, and would continue to collect until he set it down, which he was not going to be able to do for a long time. The woods behind her house were exactly as he had known they would be. Quiet, in the way of forest in early autumn, the particular hush of trees that have not yet begun to lose their leaves in earnest, the ground soft and dark beneath them, the light coming down in the diffuse way of an overcast afternoon. They walked without speaking for several minutes, Bella moving through the trees with the careful attention to her own footing that her relationship with physical stability required, Edward moving beside her and hearing the forest and her heartbeat, and beneath both of those things the approaching moment, which had a sound of its own that he had been hearing all day. He stopped when they were far enough from the house that Charlie would not hear anything, far enough from the road that no passing car would catch a fragment of what was going to happen. He had measured this in advance. He had known precisely where to stop, had identified the location during one of the night walks he had taken in the week since the family meeting, scouting the ground the way he scouted everything that required preparation. He turned to face her. She was looking at him with the expression she wore when she knew something was coming and had decided to wait for it rather than ask. He had seen this expression before. It was the expression she had worn in the weeks after the birthday party, when his behavior had begun to change, and she had noticed the change and had not confronted it, I had simply watched and waited with the patient attention she gave to things she was trying to understand. He recognized it now, and it cost him something to see it. The specific cost of being known by someone, even incompletely, even from the outside, even without access to his thoughts. He began. The words were exactly as he had rehearsed them. This was important. He had prepared them because spontaneity would not serve him here, because the unplanned word was the one most likely to carry feeling, and feeling was what he could not afford to allow into this conversation if it was going to accomplish what it needed to accomplish. He told her that the family was leaving Forks, that this had always been temporary, that they moved regularly, that Forks had run its course the way all of their locations ran their course, and he said this with the measured tone of someone communicating logistical information rather than dismantling something, and he heard her heartbeat change as she processed it, a slight acceleration that she would not have been aware of and that he could not stop tracking even now. Then he told her that he was not taking her with him. He heard the change in her breathing before he heard any change in her heartbeat, which was the reverse of the usual order, and the reversal registered somewhere in him as information he did not know what to do with and filed away without processing, because processing it was not something he could do right now. She asked why. He had the answer prepared, had been preparing it for weeks, and he delivered it with the controlled flatness he had been practicing in his room, that this had been a distraction for him, and that she was not right for his world, had never been right for it, that the relationship had served a purpose, and the purpose had been fulfilled. He said she was not good for him, which was the inversion of the truth he had been building toward leaving on, the truth being that he was not good for her, and the inversion was deliberate, was the specific piece of the construction that was most likely to produce what he needed it to produce, which was her belief that the problem was hers rather than his, that she lacked something rather than that he was removing himself for her sake. He watched her face as he spoke. He could not look away. He had considered looking away, had thought about whether the performance of indifference required him to maintain or avoid eye contact, and had decided that avoiding it would look like guilt, and guilt was not the impression he was trying to create. So he held her gaze, and he delivered each prepared sentence, and he watched her face do the things it did when she was receiving information that was reorganizing her understanding of something she had believed she knew. She was very still. This was unexpected, or perhaps not unexpected, given what he knew of how she handled things she found difficult, but it registered as something he had to actively manage around. He had prepared for questions. He had prepared for arguments, had anticipated the particular form her directness might take if she decided to challenge what he was saying. He had not fully prepared for this stillness, this quality of someone absorbing something without immediately responding to it, taking it in fully before deciding what to do with it. Then she asked the question he had been both dreading and expecting, since he had first constructed the answer to it 3 weeks earlier in his room. She asked if he did not want her. The question was simple and direct and completely accurate, which was characteristic of her, the absence of circumlocution, the willingness to name the thing plainly rather than approaching it sideways. He had known she would ask it in some form. He had prepared the answer. The answer was a single word, the smallest possible unit of what he needed to say, and he said it. No. The word word left him and entered the air between them, and he heard it with the part of him that had been listening to language his entire existence, had been hearing the gap between what people said and what they meant for 90 years. And he heard his own word, and heard it clearly for what it was, which was the most precisely constructed lie he had ever told. Bella did not cry, not immediately. She received the word with the same stillness she had received everything else he had said, and she looked at him, and he looked back, and the silence between them had a quality entirely unlike the silence of her mind, which had always been peaceful. This silence was the opposite of peaceful. This silence was the sound of something changing in a way that could not be unchanged. He told her he was leaving immediately, that the family was already preparing, that he would not see her again after this, that she should not try to find him or contact him, that the clean break was the kindest version of what needed to happen. And he said this with the same flat control he had maintained throughout, and he heard her heartbeat and her breathing and the small sounds of the forest around them, and he held all of it with both hands and did not allow any of it to enter his expression. She asked him not to do this. He had prepared for this too. He had prepared for the request, for the possibility that she would ask him directly to reconsider, and he had his response ready, and he delivered it, and the delivery cost him more than he had predicted it would, which was information about the limits of preparation that he filed away without acting on. He asked her to promise that she would not do anything reckless. The request surprised him even as he made it, emerging from somewhere beneath the prepared script, and from the part of him that was conducting the practical execution of a plan, and the part of him that loved her and could not make those two parts entirely separate even now, even here. She looked at him when he asked it, and something in her expression shifted, something he could not fully interpret without access to her thoughts, and she made no response to the request, which he took as the closest thing to a promise she was going to give him in this moment. He told her to stay where she was, that he was going, and that she should wait, and then make her way back to the house. He said it with the same measured tone he had used throughout, and she stood with her arms wrapped around herself in the way she stood when she was very cold, though it was not particularly cold, and he understood that the gesture was not about temperature. He looked at her one last time. He had not planned to do this. The plan did not include a final look, had been designed specifically to avoid any action that might function as a farewell, because farewells carried tenderness, and tenderness was what the performance could not contain. But he looked anyway, in the space of a single second that his mind recorded with the complete and permanent fidelity that characterized his memory, the way all his memories were recorded, without degradation, without the merciful softening that human memory applied to things that hurt. He would have this forever, exactly this, the trees and the grey light, and the particular way she was standing, and the expression on her face and all of it, preserved in perfect detail, available to him at any moment for the rest of his existence, and which was going to be a very long time. Then he was gone. Not metaphorically, not gradually. He moved at the full speed available to him, the trees becoming a blur, the distance from her doubling and doubling again in seconds, the sound of her heartbeat dropping behind him as he ran, and then fading, and then becoming something he was reaching for rather than receiving, straining his hearing to its limit to maintain the thread of it until the thread was simply too attenuated to hold. He stopped when he could no longer hear her. He stood in the forest some distance east of her house, and he listened to the woods around him, to the rain that had begun to fall in the thin, indifferent way of Fork's rain, and he waited. Not because he was uncertain whether to return. He was not uncertain, but because he needed to know she was moving, needed to confirm through whatever sensory information was still available to him that she was upright and walking and making her way back toward the house. He could not hear her heartbeat from this distance. He could not hear her footsteps or her breathing. He was waiting on faith, which was not a thing he generally operated on, and the experience of it was as uncomfortable as he would have predicted. Several minutes passed. Then he heard Charlie's cruiser arrive in the driveway of the Swan house, earlier than expected. Some shift change or errand bringing him home before his usual time. He heard Charlie's thoughts, routine and domestic, and completely unaware that anything had happened in the woods behind his house. And then he heard them shift as Charlie entered the house and found it empty, and the shift produced a low-grade alertness that Edward recognized as a father's automatic calibration of his daughter's whereabouts. She was not in the house yet. She was still in the woods. Charlie would look for her in a few minutes if she had not appeared, and the looking would produce a trail of questions Edward could not answer from here, and he filed this information in the part of his mind that was still managing logistics, and recognized that it did not change what he had done or what he was going to do next, which was leave. He ran back toward the Cullen house, not through Forks, not by any route that would bring him into view of anyone who knew him, but through the forest that connected his world to hers, at the trees that had witnessed the months of nighttime travel between the two houses, the ground he had covered so many times that he knew every variation of it, in every weather and every light. The house was already in motion when he arrived. His family had been preparing for days, the departure staged and ready to execute on his signal, and his arrival was the signal. He moved through the rooms that were being systematically emptied of everything personal and portable, and he did not linger in any of them because lingering served nothing. Alice found him in the hallway and stood in front of him with the expression she wore when she had something to say and was not certain how it would be received. She had seen something. He heard it in her thoughts before she spoke. A fragment of vision that had arrived in the last hour while he had been in the woods. She told him what she had seen. Bella on the ground in the forest, not moving, not injured, her heartbeat steady, her breathing normal, but not moving, simply lying on the ground among the roots, with her arms around herself, in the same gesture he had last seen her making when she was standing in front of him. Edward stood in the hallway of his emptying house and received this information and said nothing for a moment that lasted longer than moments usually lasted for him, for whom time moved at a different pace than it did for people who had to sleep through portions of it. He had known the grief would be real. He had calculated for the grief, had built his assessment of the situation around the certainty that she would recover from it. Aka had believed this with genuine conviction, rather than simply telling himself what he needed to hear. He still believed it. The belief had not changed. The image Alice had shown him had not changed the conclusion, because conclusions did not change every time the evidence of their cost became specific. But specific was different from abstract, and the image of her on the ground in the forest was specific in a way that his calculations had not been, and he held the difference between those two things for the length of that extended moment, and then he moved on, because moving on was what the plan required, and the plan was still the plan. He walked out of the house without looking back at it. His family followed in their own vehicles, on their own routes, all of them converging on the same destination by different paths. The house would be closed up, the arrangements handled by Carlyle with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed this transition enough times to have reduced it to a sequence of steps that required minimal deliberation. He drove. The road south out of Forks ran through the same grey landscape that had characterized every morning he had spent in this town. The same overcast sky, the same rain, the same trees pressing close to both sides of the road. He'd driven this road many times in both directions, and it had never required his full attention, which was fortunate, because his full attention was not available. It was behind him, in the forest, on the ground among the roots, where the girl with the silent mind was lying with her arms around herself in the thin autumn rain. He drove, and he did not turn around, and the road carried him away from Forks with the complete indifference of roads to the significance of the journeys they facilitate, and he let it. He had chosen this. He had built this. He had executed it with everything he had, with every tool of preparation and discipline and analytical care available to him, and it was done, and it had accomplished what it was designed to accomplish, and he would not look at the cost of it for a long time yet. But he looked at it now, for exactly as long as the moment lasted, because he owed her that much honesty at least, even if she would never know he was paying it. Then the road curved and Forks disappeared behind the tree line, and he faced forward, and he drove. The first thing he noticed about existence without her was that the noise came back. Not gradually, and not in the way that something returns after a temporary absence, easing back in increments that allow for adjustment. It came back all at once, the full unfiltered volume of every mind within range pressing into his consciousness with the same relentless completeness it had always had, and the contrast was immediate and total, because he had not fully understood, until it was gone, how much of what he had experienced near Bella had been organized around the quiet she created simply by existing in his vicinity. He had known her mind was silent to him. He had known this from the first day, had identified it as the central mystery of her, had returned from Alaska partly in pursuit of understanding it. But knowing a thing analytically and experiencing its removal were not the same kind of knowing. And in the days after Forks, he discovered that the silence had done more than simply spare him the contempt of her thoughts. It had provided a kind of anchor, a fixed point of stillness in the perceptual field that his gift had been turning toward without his conscious direction, the way a compass turns toward north without being asked. Without it, the field was uniformly loud in every direction, and the loudness was not new, but it felt new, the way a sound feels louder in a room you have just re-entered than it did in the room you left. He'd anticipated missing her. He had calculated for it, had acknowledged it as a cost, and decided the cost was acceptable, had believed that the shape of the missing would be familiar to him, because he had experienced loss before, or had watched everyone he had known in his human life age and die across the decades, had learned to hold grief without being destroyed by it. He had thought He understood what this would feel like. He had been wrong about this the way he had been wrong at the beginning about the biology classroom. He had expected the familiar and encountered something categorically different, and the difference required a recalibration he had not prepared himself for. The missing was not an emotion he could locate and manage. It was structural, the way the thirst was structural, present in every moment and in every context, not spiking dramatically but simply persisting. A constant low register of absence that colored everything else without announcing itself. He would be hunting, tracking a deer through unfamiliar forest, and find that the part of his mind that had been habitually oriented toward her had nowhere to go, and was generating a kind of directionless searching that served no purpose and could not be redirected. He would be still, reading, sitting through the evening hours that had previously been spent at her window, and the hours would have a quality of waiting without an object that was unlike any waiting he had experienced before. He told himself, in these hours, what he had told himself before the decision was made, and during the execution of it, and on the drive away from Forks, that she would recover, that the grief was temporary, and the life waiting on the other side of it was permanent and real and full of things he could not give her. That he had done this correctly, had planned it carefully, I had given her the cleanest available version of a painful thing. That the plan was working. The plan was working. He was not in Forks. He was not sitting beside her in biology, putting her at risk with his proximity. Jasper was not in the same room as her blood. She was not at the birthday party every day of her life. The operational conditions that had produced the birthday party's near catastrophe had been systematically removed, which was what the plan was designed to accomplish, and it had accomplished it. And this was success. He returned to this framework when the structural missing became difficult to work around, and the framework was solid, and returning to it helped somewhat. The somewhat was something he had not fully planned for. He had expected the logic to be more sustaining than it was, and he had expected that a decision made through careful reasoning would be supported by that reasoning after the fact, that the work of arriving at the conclusion would continue to do useful work once the conclusion had been acted on. Instead, he found that the logic and the missing existed in separate registers that did not communicate with each other, that the soundness of the argument did not reduce the weight of the absence, that he could hold both of them simultaneously and find no relief in their coexistence. This was new information about the limits of his own architecture, and he held it without knowing what to do with it. The family had settled in a house outside Ithaca, New York, chosen by Carlisle for its proximity to Cornell and its distance from everywhere they had recently been. It was a large house at the end of a long driveway, surrounded by the kind of established deciduous forest that turned colors in autumn and was, in the early weeks of their residence, doing exactly this with the complete indifference of natural processes to the emotional states of those observing them. The colors were extraordinary. Edward noted this with the part of him that registered beauty automatically, that had been registering it for 90 years, and filed it without feeling particularly enriched by it. His family moved around him with the careful consideration of people who are aware that someone they love is in pain and are uncertain how to address it without making it worse. Emmett was quieter than usual, his thoughts carrying a subdued quality that was foreign to his nature, and that Edward found paradoxically more difficult to receive than Emmett's ordinary directness would have been. Esme watched him with the sustained quiet attention she gave to things she was worried about, saying little, present in the way she was always present. And he heard her concern and was grateful for it, and could not do anything with the gratitude. Carlyle maintained his usual equilibrium, the deep steadiness that had characterized him across 3 centuries, and did not revisit the argument he had made in the study, which was a form of generosity Edward recognized and appreciated. Alice was the most difficult. She was watching futures. He heard it in her thoughts throughout the day, the particular quality of attention that meant she was tracking something in her visions, following threads through the shifting landscape of possibility, and he could hear that she was looking, could hear the frustration that accompanied the looking, and he knew without asking what she was looking at. She was checking on Bella. She had been checking on Bella since before they left Forks, had been watching the futures adjacent to her. With the sideways method, she had developed to compensate for the blur that surrounded Bella directly. He had asked her once, in the first week. He had asked with the carefully maintained neutrality of someone requesting factual information, rather than someone who had been reaching toward the answer since before he had finished asking the question. Alice had told him what she was seeing, and the telling had been precise and careful and had not softened anything. The blur was still there, Bella's immediate future still refusing to resolve cleanly in Alice's visions. But the futures around her, the people adjacent to her, the shape of her days, as seen through the perspectives of everyone who intersected with them, told a coherent story. She was present in all the functional senses. She was going to school, was being observed by Charlie, was maintaining the surface structure of her days with a determined practicality that was fundamental to her character. And she was not recovering, not in the timeline Edward had constructed in his planning, not at the pace he had predicted when he had told himself that the grief would be temporary. He heard this and received it and returned to his framework, and found the framework somewhat less solid than it had been before he asked the question. He did not ask again. Jasper told him something in the 3rd week that he had not expected, and that required its own recalibration. Jasper's empathic gift did not have a range limit in the way that Edward's telepathy had a range limit. Or rather, its limit was different, more dependent on emotional intensity than on physical proximity. Strong enough emotions from people whose emotional signatures he had become familiar with could reach him across significant distances under certain conditions. He had felt things from Bella before, in the months in Forks, had mentioned it to Edward in passing without either of them attaching particular weight to it at the time. He was still feeling something, not clearly, not with the definition he would have if she were in the same room, but a signal was reaching him across the distance, and faint and intermittent and consistent enough that he had begun tracking it with the same methodical attention he brought to anything that constituted data worth having. He described it to Edward with the careful precision of someone who understands they are delivering information that will be painful, but believes the recipient deserves to have it. What he was feeling from her, faintly, across the distance, was not grief in any of the forms Jasper had catalogued across his long experience of other people's emotional states. It was something quieter and more pervasive, and in some ways harder to characterize. He searched for the right word and arrived at one that Edward would turn over for a long time afterward. Empty. Edward received this word and held it, and the framework he had been returning to for 3 weeks developed in that moment, a crack that he could feel but could not repair through further application of the logic that had built the framework in the first place. He had planned for her grief. He had calculated for recovery from grief. He had not planned for empty, which was a different category, a state he recognized not as the acute pain of loss, but as something that came after the acute pain, when the pain had been present long enough that the system accommodating it had reorganized itself around the accommodation. Empty was what happened when grief became structural. And structural was not temporary in the way he had needed her grief to be temporary. He did not change course. The plan held, because the plan was still correct in every way it had been correct before. And the fact that the execution was costing more than he had predicted did not alter the correctness of the reasoning that had produced it. He had always known the grief would be real. Jasper's signal was real grief, the grief he had accounted for, and the characterization of it as empty rather than acute was a distinction in quality rather than category. He told himself this with the same thoroughness he had brought to every other phase of this process, and he believed it. And the believing helped, somewhat. And the somewhat continued to be a problem he did not have a solution for. Rosalie came to him one evening in the 5th week and told him something she had done. Standing in the doorway of the room he had been sitting in without particular purpose, her expression carrying the careful neutrality of someone prepared to be argued with, as she had contacted Bella, not directly, not with any communication that would have reached Bella as coming from within the family. She had let Charlie know, through a chain of indirection, she had arranged, with the same practical intelligence she brought to problems she had decided to solve, that Bella was worrying people who cared about her. She had not told Edward about it before she did it. She was telling him now. He did not argue. This surprised both of them. He sat with the information and examined his own response to it and found something he had not expected, which was that he did not want to argue, that some part of him was not sorry she had done it, and the not sorry was information he examined carefully and then set aside because it was not actionable without dismantling the plan, and the plan was still the plan. He thanked her. The word landed strangely in the room between them, too simple for everything it was carrying, but Rosalie received it with the same careful neutrality she had brought to the doorway and left without either of them saying anything else. He hunted that night, alone, further into the forest than he usually went, driving the thirst down with the same obsessive thoroughness he had applied before every school day in Forks, though there was no school day coming, no biology class, no lab table, no heartbeat 2 feet away requiring the most fortified version of his control available. He did it anyway, because the motion of it was something to do, and doing something was better than sitting in the house waiting for Alice's visions to tell him something he had not decided he was allowed to act on. He was still waiting when he came back, when he sat through the evening, and then the night, and then the following days. He was waiting for the evidence he had promised himself would come, for the signs Alice's visions would eventually show of Bella moving forward, engaging with a life on the other side of the grief that he had told himself was waiting for her. He was waiting for the plan to demonstrate its own correctness in terms that went beyond the logical soundness of its construction. He was still waiting when Rosalie called him with the news about the cliff. The call lasted less than 30 seconds. He heard her voice, and he heard the words, and the framework he had been maintaining for months came apart in the space of a single breath, quietly and completely, the way structures come apart when the thing they were built around is suddenly no longer there, and he was already moving before the call ended. He called the Swan house first. This was not part of any plan. There was no plan anymore. Had not been one since Rosalie's call had lasted its 30 seconds and left him standing in a room that had suddenly reorganized itself around a single piece of information he did not yet know how to hold. He called the Swan house because it was the first thing his hands did when his mind came back online after the initial seconds of total stillness, dialing the number he had memorized without intending to. Across the months of knowing it was Charlie's number, and Charlie was the person standing between Bella and a world that did not know how to keep her safe. Jacob Black answered. He heard the voice and identified it immediately, the particular quality of Jacob's thoughts arriving alongside the sound of him, and he asked for Bella with a composure that cost him more than anything he had spent in a long time. Jacob's response was brief, and his tone carried something in it that Edward could not fully read from this distance, a flatness that might have been grief or anger, or the specific emotional exhaustion of someone who has been awake for too long, dealing with something too large. And then the line went quiet, and Edward understood from the quiet that Bella was not going to come to the phone. He understood other things from the quiet too. He understood that Jacob knew who was calling and had decided not to pretend otherwise. He understood that Jacob had been there, had been present in whatever had happened, and that his presence in her life during the months of Edward's absence was not incidental. He filed this information in the part of him that was still capable of filing things, which was a smaller part than usual, and he ended the call. The fact of her death sat in him for the duration of the call and for the minutes that followed it, and he examined it from every angle his analytical mind could find and arrived each time at the same place. She was gone. The plan had been built around her survival, had been justified by her survival, had derived its entire moral logic from the premise that removing himself from her life would result in her living a full human life, rather than a short and dangerous one. Without that premise, the plan was not a sacrifice. It was simply a loss, uncompensated by any outcome that justified the cost of it. He did not weep. This was not because he did not feel what the information required him to feel. It was because the feeling was too large and too immediate to produce the ordinary expressions of grief, which required a certain amount of space between the feeling and its manifestation that did not exist in this moment. What he felt was more like a structural failure, the internal equivalent of weight-bearing elements giving way simultaneously, and the experience of it was not dramatic but absolute. He was going to go to the Volterra. He did not make this decision in the way he had made the decision to leave Forks, through weeks of accumulated reasoning and careful testing of conclusions against counter-arguments. He made it in the way of someone whose decision-making framework has been simplified to its most basic elements by the removal of every consideration that had previously complicated it. He was going to Volterra. He was going to ask the Volterra to end his existence. And when they refused, as he knew they would refuse because the Volturi did not perform favors for individual vampires regardless of the reasoning offered. He was going to force their hand by doing something they could not ignore in a location they could not permit to be ignored. This was not despair in the way despair is usually understood. He was not overwhelmed, not irrational, not operating from the compromised judgment of someone whose emotional state has exceeded their capacity for clear thought. He was operating with perfect clarity, which was the part that would have been most disturbing to anyone who could have seen it. The logic was clean. Bella was gone. His continued existence had been justified, for the better part of a year, by the argument that it was better for her if he existed elsewhere rather than nowhere. That argument was no longer available. What remained was an existence without the justification that had made it feel like something other than the hollow performance it had been before January of the previous year. And he had experienced that existence for 90 years, and he was not willing to return to it now that he understood the alternative. He called Alice. She answered before the first ring completed, which meant she had seen the call coming, and he heard in the texture of her silence, after she picked up that she had seen more than just the call. She had seen where it was going. He heard the specific quality of her distress, the particular form of Alice's anguish, which was always compounded by the fact that she could see what was coming and was experiencing the grief of it in advance. Living through the loss twice, he told her what he intended to do, not because he needed her permission or expected her to be able to stop him, but because she deserved to know from him rather than only from her visions, and because telling her was the last honest thing he could think of to do before the sequence of events he was about to set in motion made honesty irrelevant. Alice said one word before he could continue. She said, "Wait." He heard something in her thoughts in that moment, a shift in the visions she was watching, and an image reorganizing itself around a new variable that had just entered the calculation. He heard her processing it with the rapid, focused attention she brought to visions that were still in motion, still changeable, still dependent on decisions not yet made. He waited because Alice had earned the right to be heard, because he was not so far gone that he could not give her 30 seconds. Bella was alive. The vision had shifted because a decision had been made somewhere in the chain of events that Alice was watching. Some choice by someone that had altered the trajectory of what was coming, and the trajectory now contained Bella alive and breathing, and not at the bottom of the ocean, or wherever Rosalie's information had implied she was. Alice's visions did not show her Bella directly. The blur was still there, had always been there, but the futures around Bella had reorganized in a way that was only consistent with one interpretation. She had survived the cliff. Edward stood with this information in the same way he had stood with its inverse 30 minutes earlier, which was to say, without the capacity for the ordinary responses that information usually produced. The framework that had come apart when Rosalie called had not reassembled itself. It had simply been replaced by a different framework in the same instant, equally total, equally absolute, and the whiplash of moving between them in the space of half an hour was something he had no vocabulary for. She was alive. The plan had been built around her survival, and she had survived. And the plan was still wrong. Had been wrong from the moment Alice's vision showed him what empty looked like from the outside and the fact of her survival did not restore the plan to rightness. It simply added itself to the pile of things that the plan had failed to account for, and asked him what he intended to do now. He told Alice he was still going to Volterra. He heard her response before she made it, heard the argument assembling in her thoughts, sharp and immediate and grounded in the specific logic of someone who has been watching futures and understands the current shape of them with more precision than he does. She told him that going to Volterra without cause was unnecessary now, that Bella was alive, that the situation had changed. He told her that the situation had been wrong before it changed and remained wrong now, that Bella alive was not the same as Bella safe, that the months of absence had demonstrated, with the specific evidence of Jasper's empathic signal and Alice's adjacent futures, that the plan had not accomplished what it was supposed to accomplish, and that returning to Forks and resuming the life he had left was not an available option, because it led to the same endpoint through a longer route. Alice was quiet for a moment that was not actually a moment in her terms. She was watching futures in real time, and then she said something he had not expected her to say. She said she was coming to Volterra. She said she had seen a future in which she arrived in time, and she intended to make that future real, and he could either work with her on that or continue his current plan, and she would still come, and she would rather he worked with her. He let her come, not because he had been persuaded, but because the 30 seconds he had agreed to give her had become something longer, and in the process of being something longer, it had introduced a variable into his thinking that had not been there before, which was the simple fact of Alice's willingness to come to Italy for him, to place herself between him and the decision she believed was wrong, to do this not through argument alone, but through presence. He drove to the airport. Alice met him there, having travelled from Ithaca at speeds that suggested she had not waited for conventional transportation any longer than necessary. She was beside him at the gate, with a particular quality of focused intensity she wore when she was watching futures in real time and managing a situation simultaneously, doing both with a fluid competence that had always made her extraordinary. And they flew to Italy. The flight was long, and neither of them slept, for the obvious reason, and Edward sat with his thoughts for the duration, and did not speak much, which Alice permitted, because she understood the difference between silence that needed to be interrupted and silence that needed to be respected. She watched futures intermittently, her eyes going distant and then returning, and occasionally she would say something small and precise that was less a statement than a navigation adjustment, a minor correction to the course of what was happening based on information she was receiving that he was not. He heard her thoughts throughout, the ongoing effort of someone managing multiple tracks simultaneously, and he was grateful for her presence in the specific way of someone who would not have asked for help and is receiving it anyway, and finds that receiving it is not the diminishment they would have predicted. Volterra was golden in the late afternoon light. He had been here before, had stood in these streets in a different century, under different circumstances, had understood then what the city contained beneath its tourist-friendly surface, and had given the Volterra's territory a wide berth for the subsequent decades. He gave it no berth now. He walked through the city with Alice beside him toward the central piazza, tracking the movement of people around him, calculating what would produce the response he needed in terms of public spectacle, and finding, for the first time in a long time, that he was not entirely certain what he wanted the response to be. He was standing at the edge of the shadow, measuring the angle of the sunlight on the stone of the piazza, when something hit him from the side with the particular force of someone who is not calculating their impact and is moving fast. He caught her before he processed who it was. Then he processed who it was. The smell of her reached him in the same instant his arms registered what they were holding. That specific and entirely particular scent that had been the first thing about her, and that his body recognized before his mind had finished confirming what his mind already knew. Her heartbeat was against his chest, rapid and real and present, and her arms were around him with a completeness of effort that suggested she had been running. I had been covering the distance between wherever she had been and wherever he was standing with everything she had. Bella. He held her, and the holding was not calculated, and was not performed, and was not any version of the thing he had been doing for the past year, which was managing. It was simply the response of every part of him to the presence of the thing that had been absent, immediate and total, and indifferent to the plan that had created the absence in the first place. He heard her heartbeat, and he heard the people moving around them in the piazza, and he heard Alice at a short distance behind him and beyond Alice. Deeper in the building at the edge of the square, the particular quality of ancient and powerful minds that he recognized from his previous time in this city and would have recognized anywhere. The Volterra were aware of them. The Volterra had been aware of them since before they entered the city, and the attention he felt from that direction was the specific attention of something very old and very certain of its own authority, deciding whether to be interested or merely amused. They were invited inside. This was not a request. The phrasing of the guards who appeared at the entrance to the Volterra's compound was courteous, in the way that invitations are courteous when declining them is not a practical option. And Edward shepherded Bella through the doors with his hand at her back, and the awareness of every variable in the room sharpening to its most precise register. Aro was exactly as he had been the last time, which was to say exactly as he had been for 3,000 years. I give or take the particular costume each century required. He received them with the specific warmth of someone who finds everything genuinely interesting, for whom the world is an endless source of fascinating material, and whose capacity for warmth and capacity for casual cruelty were not in any conflict with each other, because they operated in entirely separate registers. He took Edward's hand, and Edward felt the depth of Aro's gift, the ability to read every thought a person had ever had through a single touch, moving through him with the thoroughness of something that had been doing exactly this for millennia, and had no reason to be anything other than completely efficient about it. He felt himself read, not in the partial and surface way that his own gift operated, but completely, and every thought he had ever formed available to Aro in the moment of contact, 90 years of accumulated internal life passing through that handshake like water through a filter. Aro was interested in Bella. This was immediately apparent and immediately alarming. He took her hand and received nothing, the same nothing that Edward had been receiving since January of the previous year, and the nothing produced in Aro the same response it would have produced in any mind accustomed to complete access: fascination, the specific delight of someone who has encountered a locked door for the first time in 3,000 years and finds the novelty genuinely thrilling. He proposed, with a gracious indirection that was his style, that Bella join them, that she be transformed, that her gift be added to the Volterra's collection, and that the interesting question of what an impenetrable mind would look like from the inside of immortality be answered in the most satisfying possible way. Edward heard the proposal and heard the weight behind it, which was not a proposal at all, but a statement of the available options dressed in the language of choice. Bella would leave this room as a vampire, or she would not leave it. These were the terms the Volterra offered, had always offered to humans who had been permitted knowledge of their existence. The law was simple and had not changed in the centuries since it was established. She knew she had to be transformed, or she had to be eliminated. There was no third option that the Volterra recognized. Edward heard this and said what he said, which was that the transformation would happen, and that Bella was his, and the responsibility for her transformation was his family's to manage, and not the Volterra's concern. He said this with the composure available to someone who is operating at the outermost limit of their composure, and knows it and cannot allow it to show. And he heard Aro receive the statement and weigh it, and find it acceptable as a deferral of the question rather than a resolution of it. They were permitted to leave. This was framed as generosity and was, in its way, accurate, because the alternative had been genuinely available and had been set aside. And the setting aside was a gift of sorts, even if the conditions attached to it were not. They walked out of the Volterra's compound into the afternoon light. And Edward kept his hand at Bella's back and moved them through the streets of Volterra with the focused efficiency of someone completing an extraction. And Alice was on his other side doing her own navigation by vision, and none of them spoke until they were clear of the city and the quality of the air had changed to the ordinary air of the Tuscan countryside, rather than the specific atmosphere of a place where something very old and very powerful had just agreed to wait. In the car finally, with distance accumulating between them and Volterra, Bella asked him why. The question was simple and direct, and entirely characteristic of her, and he heard it and understood that it was not asking about the Volterra or the piazza or the plan he had set in motion from Ithaca. It was asking about the woods in September. It was asking about the word he had said when she asked if he did not want her. It was asking about all of it, the entire architecture of the past year, and it deserved an honest answer. He gave her the honest answer. Not all of it, not in the car in Tuscany with Alice in the front seat, and the Volterra's conditional generosity still fresh, but the part that was most fundamental, the part beneath all the planning and the words and the careful construction. He told her that it had never been true, that the word he had said in the woods was the most precisely constructed lie he had ever told, that the plan had been built on love and had been wrong in ways he had not understood, until the wrongness had been demonstrated at a cost he had not been able to calculate in advance, because the central variable had been, as it always had been, the one he could not hear. Bella was quiet for a moment after he finished. He could not hear her thoughts. He had never been able to hear her thoughts. She was as close to him in this car in Italy as she had been in the biology classroom on a Monday in January, and the silence that had once been a mystery and had become a sanctuary and had then become the gap at the center of every plan he had made, was still exactly what it had always been. Then she said something that he would keep, the way he kept everything, in the perfect and permanent fidelity of a memory that did not soften with time. She said she knew, not that she had known in September, not that the lie had failed to land. She had believed him in the woods, had taken the word he said at its face value because she had no access to the version beneath it, and the believing had cost her exactly what he had seen, it costing in Alice's visions and in Jasper's intermittent signal, and in the adjacent futures that had shown him empty when he had planned for recovery. She said she knew now, and she said it with the particular quality of her directness, the absence of circumlocution, the willingness to name things plainly, and underneath the plainness he heard, without access to her thoughts and without needing it, the same thing he had heard in a biology classroom the first time she had directed her attention at him, with the steadiness she brought to things she was trying to understand. She had looked at him then, and she was looking at him now, and the plan that had been built to give her a future without him was sitting in the back seat of a car in Tuscany between them, and fully visible and fully dismantled, and neither of them was pretending otherwise. The road ran west through the late afternoon light, and Edward drove, and beside him Bella was alive and present, and entirely, permanently silent in the one way that had started everything. And he understood for the first time with complete clarity what his plan had always been missing. It had been missing her. Not her safety, not her future, not the human life he had been trying to preserve for her. Her, the specific and irreducible person whose choices he had overridden with his own, whose assessment of the risk he had superseded with his superior information, whose voice in the decision about her own life he had calculated into silence, along with everything else he had calculated. The plan had had a gap where she was. She had walked through it. And here, and on the other side of everything, the plan had cost both of them. She was still looking at him with the same steadiness she had always looked at him with, and he did not deserve it, and she was offering it anyway, and he was done, finally and completely, with making decisions about what she should and should not have. The breakup was not a moment, it was a conclusion. Edward Cullen did not break under the pressure of a single evening, or lose himself to a sudden surge of fear. He acted from the accumulated weight of months of private certainty, with the same deliberateness he brought to everything. With a love so controlled, it had learned to express itself through its own destruction. The paper cut was not the cause, it was the permission. The door had already been built. The key simply arrived. And in the end, and the thing that broke the plan, was the one thing his gift could never reach. The silence inside Bella's mind. The choices she made in the dark where he could not see her. The love she carried without his knowledge and without his permission. In a place he had never once been able to enter. He came back to her window, changed, humbled, permanently unable to complete the separation he had so carefully constructed. Some plans are made to be broken by the very thing that made them necessary. Now let the night carry you somewhere softer than those woods. Let your breath slow and drift into the quiet where no plans are needed and nothing remains but rest. Good night.